Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, the 9,763rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence here today underscores the importance of the subject matter under consideration. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I'd like to invite the representatives of the following countries to participate in this meeting: South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belgium, Brazil, Cameroon, Chile, Cuba, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Spain, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Ireland, Israel, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Malaysia, the Maldives, Morocco, Mauritania, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Oman, Uganda, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Syrian Arab Republic, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Thailand, Tunisia, Turkey, and Vietnam. It is so decided. I propose that, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and previous practice, that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I now invite Mr. Tor Wensland, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following persons to participate in this meeting: His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations; His Excellency Mr. Cheikh Nyang, Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People; and His Excellency Mr. Paul Beresford-Hill, Permanent Observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta to the United Nations. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 on its agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wensland.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, Excellency, we have now entered the second year of this horrific conflict, and the region is on the verge of yet another serious escalation. The violence in the occupied Palestinian territory and wider regions shows no signs of abating. Just yesterday in Gaza, Israeli forces struck a building in Beit Lahia, leaving at least 60 Palestinians killed, including at least 25 children, according to preliminary figures provided by Gaza Ministry of Health. This strike is yet another in a deadly series of recent mass casualty incidents in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. We are witnessing not only a horrific humanitarian nightmare, but a rapidly accelerating and unraveling of the prospects for a sustainable resolution to this conflict. Last week, I was again in Gaza Strip, and what I witnessed defies imagination. In the southern part of the Strip, I saw the sheer magnitude of the devastation this war has inflicted on the population. I saw immense destruction of residential buildings, roads, hospitals and schools. I saw thousands of living in makeshift tents with nowhere else to go as winter is approaching. Let me add, Mr. President, anecdotally, that on the way from the crossing into Gaza up to the Japanese health compound in Khan Yunis, in and out of the Strip, I could only count 2 buildings, 2, that were not totally or partly destroyed. I spoke with our UN colleagues and their humanitarian partners who face increasing challenges in their tireless efforts to deliver vital assistance. They described the dire humanitarian situation in northern Gaza, which was received virtually no humanitarian assistance since the start of October. I heard also from Palestinian NGOs whose demands were very clear. The war must end. Civilians must be protected and they must be able to access assistance to meet their basic needs. And even in the face of just trying to survive, they recognize that there must be a kind of political solution here for the conflict to end, the occupation. In Israel, I've also heard, and repeatedly, the cries of victims. The 7th of this month was a grim marker of Hamas' horrific attack in Israel that terrorized the population and marked a year of captivity for hostages still held in Gaza in unbearable condition, denied ICRC visits, and their fates unknown. For them as well, this nightmare must end. And the hostages must be freed. Mr. President, we are also at the most dangerous juncture in the Middle East in decades. You were briefed yesterday by my colleague on the serious escalations between Iran and Israel this month. Meanwhile, the hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel are inflicting civilian casualties, massive displacement and destruction on both sides of the Blue Line. Armed groups operating from Yemen, Iraq and Syria also continued to launch missiles and projectiles towards Israel. Israel has reportedly carried out dozens of airstrikes in Syria in the past month. Every effort by all of us must be made to de-escalate the situation and establish a different trajectory towards greater peace and stability in the region. We need a ceasefire. We need the hostages released from Gaza now. I urge all parties to engage constructively in urgent diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation and avoid an endless spiral of death and destruction. In the almost 13 months since the brutal attacks prepared by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on 7 October 23, more than 42,000 Palestinians and over 1,600 Israelis and foreign nationals have been killed, with 101 hostages still held in captivity in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been injured, the vast majority of them Palestinians, including a staggering number of women and children. Palestinian medics, journalists, and over 230 UN staff has been killed. Israeli military operations and fighting with Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups continued across the Strip. Israeli military evacuation orders cover over 80% of the Strip. Nearly 2 million people are displaced. In recent weeks, Israeli military operations have intensified in the northern Strip, killing more scores of Palestinian military actions have also caused the closure of essential services, including water wells and medical facilities, further exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. I again unequivocally condemn the widespread killing and injuries of civilians in Gaza, the endless displacement of the population in Gaza, and the shocking mistreatment of detainees. I also condemn the continued holding of hostages in Gaza and the firing of rockets towards Israeli population centers, which has continued this month. Mr. President, a fundamental shift is required to improve humanitarian operations in Gaza. It is essential to establish a safe, enabling environment, meet operational requirements, including funding, and assure that the Israeli authorities facilitate access that would allow for unimpeded movement of food, shelter materials for the winter, medicine, food, and the capacity to repair essential life-saving infrastructure. The mounting lawlessness inside the Strip must also be addressed. The second round of polio campaign began on 14 October in central and southern Gaza, but and it was very successful with over 90% vaccinated, but we have yet to access the north. I urge Israeli authorities to facilitate the full rollout of the campaign and to facilitate a similar coordinated efforts to meet winter needs. As the focus remains on Gaza and the escalating violence in the region, the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is also deteriorating. Violence continued at alarming levels, having intensified since the conflict in Gaza began. During the reporting period, 54 Palestinians, including 3 women and 8 children, were killed, mostly in the context of ISF operations in Area A, which the IDF say are targeting Palestinian armed groups and militants. In the same period, 8 Israelis, including 4 women, were killed by Palestinians in shooting attacks in the West Bank and Israel. Another 2 Israelis, including 1 woman, was killed in separate shooting attacks in Israel by Arab citizens of Israel. On the 1st of October, 2 Palestinians carried out a shooting and stabbing attack in Jaffa, killing 7 and wounding 15. On the 3rd of October in Tulkarem, 18 Palestinians were killed in an Israeli airstrikes, including 1 woman and 3 children. ISF said that they killed a Hamas commander and several Hamas and PIJ militants in the camp. This was the single deadliest such incident in the West Bank in nearly 20 years. With the start of the olive harvest this month, daily settler attacks and harassment continued across the West Bank, sometimes with the presence or support of Israeli forces. On 17 October, an IDF personnel shot dead a 59-year-old Palestinian woman harvesting olives in the West Bank. The olive harvest is critical to the Palestinian local economy. However, settler violence, along with restrictions on access to land imposed by both settlers and Israeli forces, place it at grave risk. I strongly condemn all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror. I call on Israel to protect the Palestinian population and to hold perpetrators of all violence accountable. I urge security forces to exercise maximum restraints and use lethal forces only when it is strictly unavoidable to protect life. Mr. President, on 28 October, the Israeli Knesset adopted 2 laws on UNRWA, forbidding Israeli state officials from contact with UNRWA or its representatives and prohibiting UNRWA operations within what is referred to as the sovereign territory of the State of Israel. These developments risk the collapse of UNRWA's operational across the occupied Palestinian territory and severely undermine humanitarian operations in Gaza, which rely on UNRWA. These bills are set to go into effect in 90 days. The right of Palestinian refugees were set out in a General Assembly resolution that predates the creation of UNRWA. Unilateral steps, such as legislation, which seeks to not only undermine UN mandate work, but threaten to further set back a political resolution to the conflict on the basis of UN resolutions and international law, must be avoided. Mr. President, the confluence of challenges across the region requires us to act with urgency to cease hostilities and de-escalate. We must have a ceasefire now. We must have release of hostages in Gaza now. Without a ceasefire, the fundamental shift required to scale up humanitarian assistance that can meet the current catastrophe in Gaza and to improve the situation for the humanitarian deliveries. We must also concretely advance a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including by seizing irreversible and unilateral steps on the ground that undermine two-state solution. We urgently need a set of understandings to establish a political and security framework in Gaza in line with the principles I've outlined repeatedly to this Council. This framework must facilitate a Palestinian government structure that can reunify Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, politically, economically, and administratively, with no reductions in its territory, with no displacement of Palestinians from the Strip. All efforts to these ends must be prioritized. I'm very concerned that facts on the ground are being established that will undermine these core principles for years to come. This includes the attempt by Israel to dismantle UNRWA. I have repeatedly said there can be no long-term solution in Gaza that is not political. There must be a path to the end of the occupation and achieve a two-state solution. Mr. President, finally, Israelis and Palestinians don't deserve this unrelenting conflict that has ruined countless lives. They deserve a better future, one without open-ended conflict, occupation, and a regional war. We must do everything in our power to chart a course towards a just and lasting peace that will enable two-state solution and on the basis of UN resolution, previous agreements, and international law, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. The UN stands ready to support all these efforts. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Tor Wensland for his briefing. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you for your decision to personally preside over this meeting and to express our appreciation to the ministers who are taking part in this open debate. Allow me also to thank the briefer, Mr. Tor Wensland, and through him, the United Nations, as our organization continues trying to uphold its sacred mandate despite repeated Israeli attacks against the UN, its Secretary General, and its personnel. Mr. President, in the words of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I quote, "The darkest moment of the Gaza conflict is unfolding in the north of the Strip, where the Israeli military is effectively subjugating an entire population to bombing, siege, and risk of starvation. The Israeli government's policies and practices in northern Gaza risk emptying the area of all Palestinians, we are facing what could amount to atrocity, crimes, including potentially extending to crimes against humanity, end of quotation. The acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs concluded on her part in the Security Council recently, and I quote, "The entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying," end of quotation. Take a moment to grasp what that means. The entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are at risk of imminent death, faced with the death penalty for refusing to leave their land. I sat in the Security Council week after week, stood before the General Assembly week after week, hoping to be able to tell my people that help is on the way. They endured horrors that you watch on your TV screens and yet can barely comprehend, but their tormentors continue to be shielded and Palestinian victims continue to be abandoned. There is a lot of solidarity and empathy in this council and in these halls and around the world. Many countries are taking bold initiatives for justice to prevail, and we are grateful to all of them. But as we barely scratch the surface of ending Israelis' impunity, Israel continues committing crimes after crime, defying every rule and all states assembled in these United Nations, betting that its will to kill and colonize will outweigh the collective will of the international community to save lives and achieve freedom and peace. Palestinians are besieged, bombed and starved, blamed for being killed. They have nowhere to go, and they know that if they leave, they will not be allowed to return. Israel denies that it is implementing the very plan you see it deploying before your eyes. It is outraged to be accused of crimes it has already confessed to. Israel wants to rewrite international law to consider that indiscriminate killing, targeting of civilians, including humanitarians and doctors and journalists, starvation as a method of war, arbitrary detention, abductions and torture, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body and health, wanton destruction, forcible displacement and colonizations are all legal as long as they are committed by Israel. They are barbaric only if committed by others. Israel is inventing a law that adapts to and changes with the identity of the victims and the identity of the perpetrators. A racist, supremacist, inhumane law. Will you allow Israel to dehumanize us further as part of its attempt to erase us? Will you? Will Israel succeed in making the destruction of the Palestinian people, starting with northern Gaza, acceptable to you? Or at least convince you it is inevitable and there is nothing you can do about it? There is a lot you can do. The Palestinian people did not surrender, neither should you. I said that more than one time. I repeat it, neither you. Mr. President, the ICJ delivered provisional orders considering that there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused to the rights found by the court to be plausible, including the right of the Palestinians in Gaza to be protected from acts of genocide and related prohibited acts identified in Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. Instead of abiding by these orders, Israel did not only breach them, it obliterated them, doubling down on its genocide. What was a real and imminent risk 10 months ago has become an undeniable reality today. Are states willing now to finally denounce this genocide, especially given Israeli crimes in northern Gaza? Are they willing to act accordingly? If not now, when? Once there are no more lives to save? Mr. President, Israel understands that to be able to pursue its genocidal and colonial campaign, it needs to dismantle the international law-based order or to carve an Israeli exception within it. It understands that the UN, its representatives and agencies, as well as the ICJ, the ICC, the humanitarian community, the journalists, are all obstacles on the way. It is no coincidence that this is the conflict with the most UN staff, humanitarians, and journalists killed. It is no coincidence that Israel has made outrageous accusations and led unprecedented attacks against the UN, the courts, the humanitarian, and media organizations in an attempt to intimidate and silence them. To better besiege the Palestinians, it needs to neutralize those who may provide them with help, those who could shed a light over the crimes against them, and those who may hold accountable those responsible. Israel is thus currently at war with the UN, with you all, declaring the Secretary General persona non grata, killing and maiming and detaining and torturing UN staff in the hundreds, attacking UN peacekeepers, including this morning in southern Lebanon, and striving to dismantle a UN agency, UNRWA. The legislation passed yesterday to destroy UNRWA's ability to serve Palestine refugees, but also its ability to help the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza survive, constitutes a new level in this war against the UN and an integral part of the all-out assault on the Palestinian people and their presence in their land, in their homeland. The entire world rose to the defense of UNRWA. The coalition to defend UNRWA at the UN is beyond 124 or 125 member states in the last few months, recognizing its vital role in providing life-saving assistance to generations of Palestinian refugees, insisting it is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and emphasizing its role as a pillar of regional stability and a lifeline of hope. Yesterday, countries around the world responded to the Israelis' legislation with statements of condemnation and outrage. And yet, Israel still sits among us and utilizes its seat to incite against the UN here. And an incitement that translates in attacks and killing and maiming of UN personnel and the bombing of UN shelters and facilities there. When will the condemnations lead to action and accountability? When? Israel is waiting to see the international response to its actions, and in the absence of deterrence, Israel will move on to the next chapter of its crimes. The genocide is only possible because of impunity. Genocide is only possible because of impunity. Israel has crossed every red line, broke every rule, defied every prohibition. When is enough really enough? When are you going to act? Mr. President, this seat where I sit, where I am sitting, belongs to the Palestinian people. This seat where I'm sitting behind the state of Palestine belongs to the Palestinian people, to every one of the millions of Palestinians. The Palestinian people who are besieged, bombed, and starved as we speak. 43,000 have been killed by Israel and are accounted for. Many more are unaccounted for under the rubble, buried under the rubble and in mass graves. 100,000 Palestinians have been maimed, many of them enduring permanent disabilities or amputations. 2 million are displaced. Entire communities endure successive attacks by occupation forces and Israeli settlers. Thousands of prisoners are arbitrarily detained, brutally assaulted, some raped, others killed while in detention, and there is still now no end in sight for their agony. We salute them from this chamber. They are the bravest among us. When council members speak, they should address them, all of them, every single Palestinian. Not me. I will vacate this seat now with one last message. This seat is not empty. It is filled with people enduring unspeakable pain that cannot reach you. You have to reach them. You are the Security Council. You have to reach every single person who is in pain among the Palestinians. That is your duty. Reach the child who, after being amputated and having lost his parents, finds himself in a tent, still under the bombs and with nothing to eat. The mother who still talks to her little child, imagining he could still be alive after months under the rubble. The father who left to find food for his family, only to return to find them all killed. Talk to them. Tell them what you intend to do. Tell them what you intend to do. Or tell them they are left alone to die. Honor the memory of those killed and save those who can still be saved by deciding on an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the provision of life-saving assistance while all efforts continue to ensure implementation of this Council's resolutions. By ending impunity and ensuring accountability, by finally bringing to an end this terrible injustice, let your actions match your words. Stop this genocide or forever remain silent. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer from the Observer State of Palestine for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a few days ago, many of you heard the testimony delivered by freed hostage Amit Susana here in the UN. She recounted her ordeal in chilling detail. Chained alone by the ankle, unable to move, and repeatedly sexually assaulted by a Hamas terrorist guard. She was forced to enter the bathroom at gunpoint, her guard subjecting her to disturbing questions and violations, knowing full well what was going to happen next. After the assault, she was forbidden even to cry or show emotion. In her appeals to member states, she begged for urgent action to secure the release of others still held captive, warning against the blind eye she feels has turned to their suffering. Given how little the hostages are mentioned by so many, it seems the blind eye she pleaded you not to turn is still blind to their suffering. However, we will not look away. We will not forget. To any hostage who might hear me, we will never forget you, never abandon you, and never stop until you are all safely home. Colleagues, each of you will speak today about UNRWA, but I have been speaking about the UNRWA's infiltration for years. In the last year, we have exposed UNRWA Gaza as a terrorist front, camouflaged as a humanitarian agency. Its payroll resembles a most wanted list rather than an aid organization. The scandals which have exposed UNRWA Gaza are almost too many to count. Nearly every time we gather here, I have new outrageous information to share on UNRWA. Less than 2 weeks ago, I shared that an UNRWA clinic was acting as a weapons storage and launch site, disguised by the blue banner of the UN. Less than a week before that, we exposed that the head of their teachers' union in Lebanon moonlighted as a Hamas commander. Or more accurately, he was a Hamas terrorist moonlighting as an UNRWA teacher. Now I can share the details of the elimination of Muhammad Abu Itiwi. He had been employed by UNRWA since July 2022. It therefore cannot be a shock that he was also a commander in Hamas's vile Nukba forces. He personally participated in and directed the brutal murder, rape, and kidnapping of Israeli civilians on October 7. Let me repeat, while Muhammad Abu Itiwi was collecting UN-funded paychecks every month, he was murdering and kidnapping Israeli civilians. It was Abu Itiwi who led the savage rampage on the bomb shelter in Re'im in southern Israel. Dozens of young people hid for their lives while their friends were being raped and murdered at the Nova Music Festival. Abu Itiwi led his men in murdering almost all of the young people hiding in the shelter and kidnapping the survivors. A UN paycheck was waiting for him in his letterbox when he went back to Gaza. After we delivered justice to this terrorist, UN officials had the audacity to mourn him. The Secretary General himself expressed outrage at his elimination. The Secretary General of the United Nations condemned the death of a terrorist who led some of the most vicious assaults on innocent civilians in modern history. Do not misunderstand me. It is legitimate to engage in debate. It is legitimate to criticize us. What is entirely illegitimate is to cover your eyes, to dismiss, to ignore what is clearly before you. It is not legitimate, nor it is moral, to ignore the indisputable fact that UNRWA Gaza has become a front for Hamas. Yet, that is exactly what the Secretary General is doing. I have often spoken in this chamber about the necessity of moral clarity. Yet the reactions from this institution and its leader to the elimination of a terrorist make it clear that clarity is lost. Look at this picture. You can see Faisal Ali Muslim El Naami in the black shirt. Here he is seen loading the lifeless body of Jonathan Samerano into his car, a grotesque trophy bound for Gaza after his terrorist comrades murdered Jonathan at Kibbutz Be'eri. An UNRWA employee, while he's being paid by the UN, is inside Israel. There is also a video showing him collecting bodies and driving them into Gaza. When you look at this horrific image, one must ask, how does kidnapping and killing civilians fit into an UNRWA employee's job description? Where in UNRWA's mandate is this justified? And do UNRWA's mandate allow it? UNRWA donors know how their funds are being used? How can any nation or official defend such a monster? How can any one of you allow him to remain involved in humanitarian efforts? These are not aid workers. These are savages who have seized UNRWA Gaza and transformed it into a Hamas chapter. These heinous criminal scandals can no longer be swept under the rug, no longer ignored. This Council, the international community, and the entire UN must accept the reality that UNRWA Gaza is beyond redemption, beyond saving, beyond reform. We must turn a new page now. While our hostages continue to be tormented by the terrorist captors in conditions we cannot begin to imagine, while UNRWA continues to provide cover for terrorists, Israel has been hard at work delivering humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. On average, over 108 trucks have entered Gaza daily for weeks. Yet, as of last week, there were 700 trucks filled with aid awaiting collection inside Gaza. Their contents are rotting away in the sun. It is clear to all those unblinded by political agenda that Israel has gone above and beyond its humanitarian obligations. The problem isn't the flow of aid, it is Hamas. Hamas hijacks supplies, storing or selling them to fuel their terror machine, while Gaza's civilians are neglected. Israel remains committed to working with our partners to deliver aid to those in need. But as long as Hamas exploits these resources, true humanitarian relief cannot reach the people of Gaza. We continue our humanitarian efforts. In particular, we have dedicated significant attention and resources to coordinating medical aid and assistance. Last week, the second round of the polio vaccination campaign was completed in southern Gaza in collaboration with WHO and UNICEF. This second stage saw almost 300,000 children under the age of 10 being vaccinated, with the campaign commencing in northern Gaza in the coming days. We also continue to facilitate the transfer of patients and medical staff to other hospitals. For example, on October 24th, our forces facilitated the transfer of patients, mostly children, from the Kamal Adwan Hospital to other hospitals in Gaza. And we thank our partners for their collaboration in such efforts. Colleagues, while Israel meets its humanitarian obligation in the south, fighting barbaric terrorists, we continue to drive Hezbollah from our border, as they launched relentless attacks against our civilians. Another civilian was killed last night. However, it is not only our civilians whose lives Hezbollah risks. As we operate in southern Lebanon, our forces have located and dismantled dozens of tunnel shafts and terrorist infrastructure, eliminated dozens of terrorists, and located massive amounts of weapons. In one particular discovery, a weapons store containing grenade launchers, missiles, RPGs, and other weapons were hidden inside a mosque, in the heart of a civilian neighborhood in Lebanon. These outrageous violations of Resolution 1701 and 1559, as well as basic laws of morality and decency, cannot be overstated. We have also proven time and time again the exploitation of unified positions by Hezbollah. We have presented mountains of evidence of Hezbollah, tunnels, bases, weapons, and observation posts placed within meters of UNIFIL bases. This situation cannot continue. UNIFIL neglected its reporting obligations on these flagrant violations for the past 2 decades. There must be change, and that change can only begin when we uproot Hezbollah from southern Lebanon, protecting Israeli and Lebanese civilians, along with the peacekeepers themselves. The Council must remember that the enemies we face do not care for human life. They do not care for the well-being of those they pretend to protect. They have only one aim: death and destruction. We have been under attack from 7 fronts for over a year now. We will continue to carry out all necessary operations in accordance with international law to ensure the safe and secure return of our 70,000 internal refugees. Mr. President, as we approach the 77th anniversary of the vote on the UN partition plan, some are under the impression that the UN somehow gifted Israel to the Jewish people, and that this gift must now be placed under a microscope. But make no mistake, you gifted us nothing. The land of Israel has been our homeland for over 3,000 years. That UN resolution was accepted by Israel, but was immediately rejected by the Arab states. Not only was it rejected, but it was also used as an opportunity to launch an invasion. They had every intention to wipe us from the face of the earth. Yet it was our strength, our resilience, our commitment that saved us from extermination. Today, that very same strength, resilience, and commitment empowers us once more, driving us to stand against the barbarism and evil which seeks to destroy us again. Do not forget, Israel was forged through our sacrifice, our blood, not your words. While our state is no longer an infant, we still face new and constant threats from those who desire our extinction. The international community should correct historic wrongs and support us in our efforts to defend our state and people. It must not continue to unfairly scrutinize Israel and enable the terrorists who still to this day hold our civilians hostage. To conclude, I would like to ask each of you to take a moment, not now, later today when you go back to your residence. Put yourselves in our shoes. Imagine for a minute your country, surrounded on all sides by enemies attacking your people, your families, your homes, striving for your destruction. Ask yourselves frankly, what would you do? Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. Dear colleagues, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, violence continues to fuel violence in Israel, in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. This spiral of violence is now impacting the entire region. This dynamic of conflict has lasted for decades and unfortunately has worsened since the Hamas terror attacks against Israel on the 7th of October 2023. We are now beyond the bounds of all humanity. Since then, this Council has adopted 4 resolutions which Switzerland has endorsed. They have called for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, for a ceasefire in Gaza, for respect for international law, for the protection of civilians, and for unfettered access for humanitarian aid. Yet, none of these resolutions has been implemented. This undermines the credibility of this Council. The Geneva Conventions and international law are regularly flouted by all state and non-state actors. This is unacceptable. More than a year after the 7th of October 2023, Hamas is still holding 97 hostages and is indiscriminately pursuing hostilities against Israel. More than a year after these acts of terror, regional escalation could not be prevented. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, to call time and time again on the parties in the conflict to respect and to implement this Council's decisions is an exercise which is becoming meaningless. This is a genuine tragedy given the growing need to implement our decisions. To launch such appeals does not mean much if all of us, those of us in this room and those on the battlefield, are not living up to our responsibilities. That is a responsibility we bear as signatories to the Geneva Convention. We need strong determination by all high contracting parties to ensure greater humanity in the war. On the 18th of September, Switzerland welcomed the UN General Assembly decision to organize in Geneva a conference of the high contracting parties for the implementation of the 4th Geneva Convention on the protection of civilians in occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. My country is preparing to take on that task. Excellencies, distinguished ministers, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to find a way out of this conflict. The decision taken yesterday by the Israeli Parliament against UNRWA is a new turning point in the conflict. Not only is this decision to a large extent incompatible with international law, but it threatens humanitarian assistance provided to the civilian population living in great suffering. To date, UNRWA has provided that assistance. Switzerland expects Israel to shoulder its obligations pursuant to international law and pursuant to the UN Charter and international humanitarian law. My country will continue to help the civilian population in respecting our humanitarian tradition. But humanitarian assistance, ladies and gentlemen, is not the lasting solution to this conflict. I firmly believe that peace in the Near East will be ensured through political means, or it will not. The time has therefore come to accelerate efforts by countries seeking such a solution. A short, medium, and long-term ceasefire agreement, we believe, is a real possibility. Switzerland continues to believe that the political two-state solution is also possible and desired. The purpose of any political solution is to offer Israelis and Palestinians the possibility of living in peace and in security. To leave this land to violence and to destruction is not an alternative worthy of the values which we represent here in this Council, nor is it an alternative compatible with our humanity. Let us therefore work together on a political solution with the parties in the conflict, with states of the region who are committed to a two-state solution, and with members of this Council. Switzerland welcomes any initiative in this direction, and I will mention three, although there are more. Mediation by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt for the release of hostages and a ceasefire in Gaza, or the launching on the 26th of September here in New York of the Global Alliance to push for a two-state solution. Tomorrow we will be participating in the first meeting to be held in Riyadh. That is a follow-up meeting, or France's initiative for a political solution to the alarming situation in Lebanon. My country calls on all parties to the conflict to commit in good faith to negotiations and to respect their obligations under international law. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are meeting here as well to reaffirm the key role of the United Nations for peace, stability, and humanitarian aid in the region. Any UN agency must be able to carry out its work and help individuals in need. And the UN Secretary-General must be able to speak without hindrance with all parties. Any unilateral attempt to weaken his mandate will only weaken multilateralism as a whole. We created multilateralism in point of fact to guarantee peace and security in the world. This is a world in which Switzerland is prepared to play its part. Thank you for your kind attention. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Hugh Hilton Todd. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank the Special Coordinator, Tor Westland, for his briefing. Mr. President, the war in Gaza has set several new and unacceptable bars. Among them, a rapid decline in the nutritional status of the population in Gaza, not seen anywhere else on the globe. The highest number of humanitarian workers killed in a single conflict globally. Further, more women and children have been killed in this Gaza war than in any other recent conflict in a single year. We have witnessed too often the tragic irony of sophisticated precision weaponry striking innocent human beings instead of military targets. Women, children, the elderly, the disabled, aid workers, their life cut short, extinguished amidst the rubble of homes, schools, hospitals, and places of worship. More than 42,000 persons have been killed and over 100,000 injured. Among the dead, at least 13,000 children, nearly 1,000 of them below the age of 1 year. Mr. President, Guyana remains deeply troubled by the ongoing situation in North Gaza, where the population has been under siege and subject to a bombing campaign for more than 3 weeks. We share the concern of the United Nations Human Rights Office that Israeli military action in the northmost governorate of Gaza may be causing the destruction of the Palestinian population. We call on Israel to comply with its obligations under international law regarding the protection of the inhabitants of the territory which it is illegally occupying, as determined by the International Court of Justice. All this is happening in full glare through an unprecedented flow of information in real time about the atrocities being perpetrated. The world today is much better positioned than we were 30 years ago. For example, to act based on real-time information. Against this reality, inaction in the face of such overwhelming human suffering to which we are witness every single day cannot be justified. Guyana appeals to this Council to unite to halt the unceasing onslaught of the Palestinians in Gaza and to help de-escalate and stabilize the situation in the wider Middle East. To do otherwise would be to abrogate our primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, the hopes for peace for Palestinians are to be extinguished even as the risks to peace for Israelis continue to mount. We are concerned that the prospects for the future of peace in the Middle East will further be endangered if the persistent cycle of violence and recrimination is not curtailed. We also caution against the perils attendant upon the othering of people, which, as history has shown, could engender the most egregious violations of human rights. The Security Council, aided by international law, has a duty to act on the side of peace and justice and in favor of a two-state solution. Mr. President, the bills passed in the Israeli parliament yesterday regarding UNRWA's operations in the occupied Palestinian territory gave cause for grave concern. They risk compounding the oppression of the Palestinian people. Should UNRWA be dismantled, the implications would be devastating for the millions of Palestinians who depend on its life-saving services in the absence of an independent Palestinian state. UNRWA's mandate was created by the General Assembly and can therefore only be altered by that body. We urge careful consideration by all concerned of the implications of unilateral action in a sensitive case. Mr. President, I conclude by underscoring the following 3 points. First, achieving a ceasefire is now more urgent than ever, and the Security Council must immediately rise to the occasion. Second, it is equally urgent to secure the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza, as well as the release of Palestinian civilians, including children, who have been arbitrarily detained in Israel. Third, we must urgently address the unprecedented humanitarian situation in Gaza. Guyana is particularly disturbed about what is taking place in North Gaza, where the level of food insecurity is compromising people's immune systems, subjecting them to wasting and other intolerable forms of suffering. Children are bearing the brunt of acute malnutrition, and famine is all but confirmed. Let us act now to end this war and the suffering of the Palestinian people. Our common humanity demands it. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Coordinator Winsland, for your sobering briefing. I don't know how many people in this room have watched a child die of starvation. I have. It was nearly 3 decades ago, but it's the kind of memory that one doesn't forget. Her rib bones poking out from under her skin, bloated belly, gaunt eyes, and I remember her mother's eyes filled with despair. And I think about her as we have seen reports that no food assistance has reached Jabalia or Beit Lahia since early October. About the ribs and the bellies, the eyes of children in northern Gaza, and about their parents, themselves having gone days without food, desperate to save them. This unimaginable suffering was set in motion by Hamas on October 7th, and the United States has not been shy about criticizing this council's failure to condemn Hamas's atrocities and repeated violations of international law. Many in this council have not done as of yet. At the same time, the United States has made clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu that 1 year into this conflict, Israel must address the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that the United States rejects any Israeli efforts to starve Palestinians in Jabalia or anywhere else, and that Israel's words must be matched by action on the ground. Right now, that is not happening. This must change immediately. The U.S. has stated clearly that Israel must allow food, medicine, and other supplies into all of Gaza, especially the north, and especially as winter sets in, and protect the workers distributing it. In this regard, I reiterate our deep concerns about legislation adopted by the Knesset regarding UNRWA. There's no denying the fact some UNRWA personnel were involved in the October 7 attacks. This council heard directly from families of hostages taken into Gaza by UNRWA staff, as we just heard from the Israeli ambassador. UNRWA itself has confirmed that there were some Hamas members found among its personnel. In addition, though we acknowledge the steps UNRWA has taken to implement the reforms outlined in the Kelowna report, we need this progress to accelerate. And we call on the Secretary General to create a mechanism to review and address allegations that UNRWA personnel have ties to Hamas and other terrorist groups. At the same time, we know that right now there is no alternative to UNRWA when it comes to delivering food and other life-saving aid in Gaza. Therefore, we have concerns about this legislation being implemented. Instead of speaking at one another, Israel and the UN must speak to one another to address the fears that led to the Knesset's legislation and to ensure that UNRWA can fulfill its critical mandate, rebuild confidence in its mission, and the hundreds of staff who are not associated with Hamas. In addition, as President Biden has reiterated, Israel must conduct its operations in Gaza in a way that protects civilians and adheres to international law. Efforts by the Israeli government to facilitate humanitarian assistance is appreciated, but much more has to be done. We all know that Hamas uses schools, it uses hospitals, and ambulances to hide weapons and fighters. But harrowing reports of medical staff being arrested by Israeli forces at hospitals in northern Gaza are also deeply troubling. We urge Israel to publicly address these allegations immediately. And we reiterate there must be no forcible displacement, no reoccupation, and no territorial reduction of Gaza, period. Colleagues, in addition to sounding the alarm over the urgent humanitarian situation in Gaza, we must also not ignore the rising violence in the West Bank. Israeli authorities must intervene when extremist settlers launch attacks and hold perpetrators to account. The United States will continue to sanction actors that commit and enable violent activities or foment extreme instability and violence against civilians in the West Bank. What's more, the United States has been clear. The Israeli government's settlement program is inconsistent with international law and harmful to the prospect of a two-state solution. So too is undermining the West Bank's economy. We urge Israel to release withheld clearance revenues and extend waivers for Israeli banks, helping maintain correspondent banking relationships with the Palestinian equivalents, especially given assessments that these institutions can adequately prevent money laundering and financing of terrorism. Colleagues, I know it feels impossible with so much suffering now to think about the day after, but we must reject the false choice between alleviating pain today and preventing it tomorrow. The elimination of Sinwar, along with much of Hamas's senior leadership and terrorist infrastructure, presents an opportunity for the parties to re-engage and, most importantly, finalize a ceasefire deal with hostage release consistent with Resolution 2735, to begin taking steps to achieve a day after in Gaza without Hamas in power, terrorizing Israelis and Palestinians alike, and to work toward a political settlement that provides a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. Let me just say here, diplomacy does work, but it takes a lot of work to get there, and we have to continue to put our efforts behind the diplomatic efforts that are currently being pursued. We have the urgent responsibility to stop the suffering of Palestinian civilians and to secure the release of hostages, to alleviate their suffering and that of their families, to make the most of this moment and ensure the parties to the conflict do the same. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Mrs. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Monsieur le Président, Excellence, Monsieur
President, Your Excellency, Ignacio Cassis,
I would like to thank you for convening this meeting of the Security Council. And we extend our sincere thanks to Mr. Wensland for his briefing. For over a year now, the Middle East, and Palestine in particular, have been gripped by worsening violence. The brutal Israeli aggression escalates daily, spilling over into Lebanon, into Syria, and beyond. A real threat to regional stability, as well as international peace and security. We witness entire communities facing death, starvation, and outbreaks. Land desecrated, and international law rendered meaningless. Indeed, the framework our predecessors built after World War II is crumbling before our eyes, unable to stand against an Israeli power shielded from accountability and enjoying total impunity. Today, unfortunately, we live in a world where might overwhelms right. Mr. President, as stated in different reliable reports and confirmed by Mr. Winnesland today in his briefing, the situation in northern Gaza is beyond catastrophic. Just yesterday, in Gaza, Israeli forces struck a building in Beit Lahia, leaving at least 60 Palestinians killed, including at least 25 children. To grasp the unprecedented level of destruction in Gaza, one only needs to look at the New York Times today. It's hard to find in Gaza a single building that remains undamaged. This destruction is not driven by military objectives, but rather reflects a policy, an Israeli policy, aimed at forcibly displacing Palestinians from their homes. As one UNRWA staff member described, people in northern Gaza are waiting for death. They are feeling abandoned, hopeless, and alone. For 3 weeks now, relentless bombing have denied even UN staff access to food and medical care. And the healthcare system in Gaza is on the brink of collapse. Kamal Adwan Hospital, who suffered several bombardments, is barely functioning, with no more blood unit, no shroud, and no basic medical supplies. As the hospital director said, we were expecting humanitarian aid to arrive, as promised by the international community, as promised by the Security Council. What we had? Only Israeli tanks came instead. Amid this crisis, polio vaccination campaign is halted now, leaving children unprotected. Furthermore, in the south of Gaza, conditions are not even better. Worse still, the situation is rapidly deteriorating as the Israeli occupation weaponizes starvation against civilians, especially children, by denying them essential food. According to verified figures, during last year, more than 200,000 aid trucks have been barred from entering Gaza. This is the real face of an Israeli occupation that threats Palestinians as less than human beings. Mr. President, UNRWA. UNRWA, the lifeline of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, faces relentless attacks by the occupying power. 231 staff members of UNRWA have been killed. 190 premises of UNRWA were bombarded by the Israeli army. And now, the operation of UNRWA are at risk of being completely halted. Just yesterday, the Israeli authorities adopted 2 bills aiming at halting UNRWA activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. Algeria firmly condemns this decision and recalls that UNRWA operates under a mandate from the General Assembly of the United Nations, warranting our collective defense and support. And UNRWA is irreplaceable, and UNRWA is indispensable. It must continue to serve as a lifeline for Palestinian refugees until a just and political solution is achieved, establishing an independent Palestinian state. Mr. President, enemy of transparency and accountability. The Israeli authorities attempt now to obscure the truth after outright denying its crime. It has even dared to threat our multilateral bodies dealing with its flagrant violation of international law, of international humanitarian law, some of which these multilateral bodies regrettably have succumbed to this pressure. As global conscience increasingly reject images of death and destruction, calling for an end of the Israeli and occupier unchecked actions, suppressing this image from the media, from reaching the world, have become a priority of the Israeli authorities. In fact, the occupying power endeavors relentlessly to hide its crime from scrutiny and from international justice. Foreign journalists are now barred from entering Gaza, not for 1 week, not for 1 month, but for more than 1 year. Moreover, the few Palestinian journalists who remain in northern Gaza find themselves in the crosshair of the Israeli occupation. Just last week, six journalists were accused of being terrorists by night to justify their killing later. This is a policy we have seen used, costing the life of already over 168 journalists in Gaza, and now tens of them in Lebanon. This cruel reality was exposed by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, who have said, and I quote, "Targeting journalists is a strategy by Israeli authorities to obstruct the documentation of crimes," end of quote. Yet, the truth cannot be erased. It lights, breaks through, clear for all to see. But, where are the voices of those who once claimed being champions of freedom of speech, of freedom of information? Why this silence in the face of such blatant transgressions? Mr. President, unfortunately, our recent deliberations have reduced Palestinian nightmare, Palestinian suffering, into a mere count of aid trucks. However, the source of the suffering of the Palestinian people is not just a humanitarian crisis. It is a political crisis rooted in decades of occupation, decades of oppression, dating back to the Nakba. In this regard, the international community failure to uphold their inalienable right has deepened the strategy, the tragedy. The core issue in the Middle East is the occupation, is the oppression. Only by addressing this root cause, we can hope for just and lasting peace in the Middle East. Let's work together to impose, yes, to impose an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, in Lebanon, and to launch a genuine peace process that brings an end to the occupation of Arab land. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Special Coordinator Tor Wensland for his briefing. Since the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th of last year, the international community has been witnessing unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe and challenges to the regional order. Violations of international law are happening each and every day. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, are being targeted. Israeli hostages are still held in Gaza. The delivery of humanitarian aid is not ensured as hunger surges. Relentless expansion of settlements in the West Bank, along with worsening violence and impunity, are slicing up Palestinian land and threatening the viability of the two-state solution. This organization, UN per se, is under severe attack. UNIFIL in Lebanon is subject to repeated attacks, Israeli acts that constitute violations of international humanitarian law. UNRWA is confronted with existential challenges and has seen 233 of its humanitarian workers killed in Gaza in the last year. Mr. President, international humanitarian law must be observed at all times. The Republic of Korea expresses its grave concern once again over escalatory Israeli attacks, killing and wounding innocent civilians. Particularly, we are disturbed by attacks on civilians in besieged northern Gaza. As aid is blocked, polio vaccination is delayed, and hungry families are being forced to flee south at gunpoint. The Republic of Korea also condemns the use of civilians and civilian infrastructure for military purposes by both Hamas and the IDF. Moreover, yesterday's approval by the Knesset of the two bills against UNRWA is extremely alarming. It is Israel's obligation under the UN Charter to assist and grant privileges and immunities for the activities of the organization. With the collapse of UNRWA, 2 million Palestinians in Gaza will suffer even worse. In the long term, too, the reality without UNRWA is unacceptable, as the agency has provided the essential services, including education and health care, to millions of Palestinian refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, and beyond for decades. Let us be clear, UNRWA is indispensable. Israel's actions against UNRWA will also have a devastating impact on Israel's relations with regional countries and the international community. As such, along with the vast majority of UN member states, the Republic of Korea urges Israel, as a decades-long member of the United Nations, to act more responsibly and to immediately stop all measures dismantling UNRWA. Mr. President, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, along with the immediate release of hostages, as well as rapid de-escalation in the region, are not an option. It is the only way to save thousands of lives and open a new pathway toward regional stability and long-term peaceful coexistence based on the two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Minister, we welcome your participation in the quarterly Security Council debate on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We'd like to thank the Special Coordinator on the Middle Eastern Peace Process, Mr. Tor Wennesland, for his overview and assessment of the situation in the Middle East in the context of the unprecedented uptick in pan-regional confrontation and violence, at the center of which lay and lies the most long-standing of the regional conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian one. Over a year ago, in the Gaza Strip, the flames of war blazed with renewed intensity. The war is already the bloodiest in the long line of Arab-Israeli wars. The number of people killed, wounded, and missing is now over 150,000, and it continues to rise unabated. Most of the victims are peaceable civilians in Gaza, among which, in fact, the majority of which are women, children, and older persons. Day in, day out, in the north of Gaza, there are reports of airstrikes on IDP and refugee camps. Owing to the latest IDP attack on Beit Lahia on the 26th of October, over 49 people died, over 80 were wounded. In the context of military hostilities and Israel's blockade on the enclave, a genuine humanitarian catastrophe is raging, with the large-scale hunger or famine, outbreaks of infectious diseases, as well as total destruction of civilian infrastructure. The number of refugees and repeatedly displaced persons runs into the millions. The dire situation persists in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. There are military raids by the Israeli army and clashes between locals and settlers, which are continuing. The number of detained Palestinians in the West Bank, starting from the 7th of October, has now exceeded 11,000 people. According to the president of the ICRC, Mirjana Spoljanic, the Israeli military operation has completely changed the very nature of the conflict towards dehumanization and the stripping of the peaceable civilians of their human dignity. A hallmark of the crisis are direct threats and the use of force by Israel against the UN and its specialized agencies. During the year since the military operation began in the Strip, over 310 humanitarian workers were killed, including 231 UNRWA staff. This is the largest loss in the history of the United Nations. The agency itself, since it was founded in 1941, has been a unique body protecting the rights of and assisting Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, the OPT, and in neighboring Arab countries. It is the backbone of the UN's humanitarian dimension in the region. A UN agency which has for decades was the main supplier of life-saving aid to Palestinians, not only in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, but also in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Today, UNRWA is on the brink of being completely dismantled. As yesterday, the Knesset adopted bills banning UNRWA's work and revoking all of its staff's immunities. Since the active phase of Israel's campaign against UNRWA began, we've said on many occasions that the stoppage of its work would have the most corrosive of consequences for the region and for the entire UN system. It sets a serious precedent which undermines the foundations of the international multilateral system of cooperation. Before our very eyes, we're seeing a violation of the UN Charter, relevant UNGA resolutions, and the UN Convention on Privileges and Immunities. Israel has, in fact, single-handedly decided to cancel this specialized UN agency, which is not to its liking. On top of that, the precipitously deteriorating situation in the OPT and the financial crisis prompted by the US's refusal to provide funding to UNRWA, yesterday's decision taken in the Knesset risks definitively dismantling the agency and its work, something Israel has been seeking for decades. We support the Secretary General's statement according to which UNRWA is irreplaceable and that there is no alternative to it. Today, when in the Gaza Strip we're seeing horrific events take place, when Gazans are being shorn of the last lifeline they have, we all know the answer to the question, can the Israeli authorities take responsibility for providing aid to Palestinians in need? And do they want to? We know the answer. Over the last few weeks, we're seeing more and more comments from UN representatives about the fact that they have no plan B if UNRWA is forced to liquidate, to dismantle. Well, the likelihood that these laws won't be implemented are almost nil. Further actions can be called something else, not just Plan B. Yet continuing to support Gazans no matter what, protecting 13,000 UNRWA staff in the Gaza Strip is something the international community is duty-bound to do. Israel's attempts to wind down UNRWA in the OPT is at odds with Israel's obligations as the occupying power, as well as the undertakings it accepted when it acceded to the UN, including the implementation of UNGA Resolution 194 about the rights of Palestine refugees to return and compensation. Mr. President, as we've said on many occasions, last year's attacks by Hamas have no justification, nor can there be any justification for them. We condemn them and continue to do so. Having said that, there is no justification for what followed. Collective punishment we meted out on millions of peaceable Palestinians. And yet Israel didn't stop there. Today, with the silent endorsement of Washington, it continues to fuel full-scale regional confrontation. The spiral of violence has moved far beyond the confines of the OPT, destabilizing the situation in the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Since the end of September, West Jerusalem opened up a second front in Lebanon, announcing an offensive operation called Northern Arrows. The stated objective is undermining the military infrastructure of Hezbollah. We're getting many reports about civilians dying in mass, indiscriminate strikes on residential, densely populated neighborhoods in Beirut and other Lebanese cities. These are being conducted by the IDF. Among the dead and wounded are civilians and, of course, many journalists and media workers. In the night between the 24th and 25th of October, the Israeli Air Force conducted a raid on the residential area of Hasbaya in southern Lebanon. As a result, 2 workers of Al Mayadeen TV station and Al Mana TV station operator died. Recently, Israelis attacked the offices of Al Mayadeen in Beirut. losses among civilians, and journalists are equated with civilians, they are civilians, are seen by West Jerusalem as collateral damage. Against this backdrop, we'd like to remind you that in southern Lebanon alone, according to preliminary figures, the number of journalists killed in last year runs into tens and dozens. Starting since the military operation in the Gaza Strip, roughly 140 media workers died in the line of duty. We cannot but conclude the fact that hunting journalists who are undermining West Jerusalem's monopoly over information about what's happening is something that Israel is doing deliberately. Given Israel's invasion of Lebanon, UNIFIL also came under attack. UNIFIL was deployed at the official behest of Beirut in accordance with Security Council decisions. The latest decision, UN Security Council Resolution 2749, was adopted unanimously in August of this year. Despite this fact, between the 10th and 17th of October 2024 alone, IDF attacked the Blue Helmet positions several times, including using tanks and weapons containing toxic substances. As a result, at least 20 people were hurt. We therefore share the assessments given by the UN. The frequency and the nature of such attacks attest to the fact that Israel is willfully trying to create threats to the life and security of peacekeepers, so as to force these peacekeepers to leave. Having said that, the Israeli leadership are demanding that peacekeepers exit, ignoring the fact that such a decision can only be taken by the Security Council, which determines the mandate and the modalities of UNIFIL's work, as well as by the Lebanese government as the host country hosting peacekeepers on its territory. Mr. President, the ongoing crisis in the OPT and in Lebanon has been a catalyst for a sharp flare-up in the widening confrontation on the brink of which now stand Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The US-Israeli tandem is trying very hard to drag Iran into this confrontation as well. The catastrophic consequences of such a scenario, catastrophic for the stability and security of the region at large, were discussed in detail yesterday in this chamber. We've said on many occasions that the root causes of repeated flashes of violence are the following. The fact that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict hasn't been settled as per UN Security Council and GA decisions. Since the very beginning, this unprecedented crisis, member states of the GA and the Security Council adopted several resolutions to de-escalate the violence in Gaza. Yet, all of these decisions remain dead letter to date. It's an open secret that to this day, these decisions cannot be implemented due to the position of just one state, the US. The US is not only providing international diplomatic cover to Israel, it's also dutifully supplying Israel with weapons and intelligence. In parallel, Washington is paralyzing the work of the Council, not letting any decisions that would limit its Middle Eastern allies' free hand in any way. They're not letting such decisions pass. Instead, our US colleagues are imposing on Security Council members their own ideas, which have not garnered support not even of the Israelis, although they're supposed to serve the Israelis' interests first and foremost. I'm referring to the so-called Biden plan for Gaza, which didn't work, as well as the initiative to introduce a ceasefire in Lebanon, which was rejected out of hand by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Our US colleagues must stop sabotaging new initiatives in the Council. As recent votes in the General Assembly show, this is what the overwhelming majority of UN member states expects of the US. Are over 40 Palestinians dead not a high enough figure to push Washington to work together with the rest of Security Council members? As we've seen for ourselves many times, any unilateral attempts to secure a truce between Israel and its neighbors without a just solution to the Palestinian question will not bring peace to the Middle East. They will prompt nothing but another cycle of escalation, similar to the one we're seeing in the region today. Mr. President, without a doubt, Israelis have a right to ensure their own security. Yet the path thereto lies exclusively through a comprehensive process of Middle Eastern settlement and the realization of Palestinians' lawful right to their own state within 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. To this end, we must ensure the implementation of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We need to end the large-scale bloodshed in the region and prevent the Middle East slipping into the abyss of a major war. We insistently urge all parties involved, within the region and beyond it, to exercise restraint, to end violence, and to avert the catastrophic scenario from coming to pass. If we want a peaceful future for Palestine, for Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, and Israeli children, we must act now. We must not dither. Otherwise, the poison of violence and revenge will contaminate the region for many years to come, meaning that the region will continue moving from one crisis to the next. I thank you. President, I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France. Mr. President, I'd like to thank Mr. Wensland for his briefing. The Security Council must take action so as to put an end to the regional escalation. In Gaza, there is an urgent need to achieve an immediate and permanent ceasefire. It's the only solution for stopping the humanitarian disaster. All hostages must be released without delay. France condemns Israel's strikes on civilian infrastructure. They are serious violations of the Geneva Conventions. We call on Israel to ensure the protection of all civilians and to lift any impediments to the delivery of aid. France is deeply disquieted by the extreme gravity of the situation in northern Gaza, where famine is already raging. France would like to recall that any forced displacement is a serious violation of international law. France has incessantly condemned the terrorist attacks and the sexual violence committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October 2023. We'd like to recall our unshakable commitment to Israel's security. Strikes were conducted by Israel on the 26th of October, targeting Iranian military sites. They were conducted in response to Iran's attack on Israel on the 1st of October. It's absolutely vital for all parties involved to abstain from any escalation or action that could exacerbate the extreme tension in the region. In the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, Israel must put an end to its settlement policy. This policy is illegal. The settlers' policy of terror must also cease. France condemns violations of the historic status quo at the holy sites in East Jerusalem, as well as provocations and unilateral measures in the West Bank. We support a Palestinian Authority that's undergone reform, that can shoulder its responsibilities throughout the Palestinian territories, including in the Gaza Strip. France will continue its efforts so as to implement the two-state solution. We will remain proactive, including here in the Security Council, working together with our partners. In Lebanon, yet again, an immediate ceasefire is required. There's an urgent need that we fully implement Resolution 1701 so as to achieve a long-term solution along the blue line, which would ensure respect for Israel's and Lebanon's security. At the behest of the President of the French Republic, France organized an international conference for supporting the people and the sovereignty of Lebanon. This happened on the 24th of October in Paris, together with the United Nations. Participating states heeded the call of the United Nations, pledging $1 billion in aid, including $100 million in humanitarian assistance and $200 million in support for the Lebanese security forces. France is committed to mobilizing 100 million euros and deploying 100 tons of humanitarian cargo. Mr. President, UNRWA is facing existential risks following yesterday's adoption by the Knesset of two laws. France calls on Israel not to criminalize the activities of UNRWA and to respect its international obligations vis-à-vis UNRWA and the United Nations. We'd like to reaffirm our support to UNRWA. I thank you. I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I welcome your convening this important session of the Security Council. I thank Special Coordinator Wensland for his sobering briefing. One destructive year has passed. Japan renewed its unequivocal and strong condemnation of the heinous terror attacks and hostage-taking by Hamas and others on October 7th last year. Since then, the Gaza's agony has been deepening. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and injured, and the population, including the hostages, are enduring unimaginable horrors. The longer the conflict in Gaza, the more innocent civilians victimized, the more hostages suffering and their lives in danger. The worse the humanitarian situation and the greater risks of the conflict spreading to the wider region. Therefore, Japan once again strongly demands the immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all remaining hostages. We support Resolution 2735 and remain hopeful that the tireless diplomacy of the US, Egypt, and Qatar would achieve a breakthrough soon. In the meantime, we must save the most vulnerable, particularly those in northern Gaza who are facing siege, bombardment, evacuation orders, and starvation. The delay in the polio vaccine campaign in the north is also deeply worrying. Moreover, Japan is gravely concerned about the Knesset bills adopted yesterday, severely restricting the operation of UNRWA, an agency indispensable for sustaining the lives of the citizens and Palestinian citizens and refugees. Any further humanitarian tragedies cannot be tolerated, and preventing them is a responsibility of the UN members. While we need to watch the reform of UNRWA, maintaining the function of UNRWA is a part of this responsibility. Mr. President, beyond Gaza, the situation in the West Bank remains serious. We call on the Israeli government to fully freeze settlement activities and take appropriate measures to prevent continued extremist settler violence. A revitalized Palestinian Authority is critical to restoring peace and stability for both Israel and Palestine. Thus, we, international community, should assist in reforming the PA, both politically and financially. For decades, Japan has provided the necessary assistance to the PA. What we have offered is not just resources or projects, but the hope for a peaceful future. We remain steadfastly committed to this end. Mr. President, Japan is deeply concerned about the exchanges of attacks among regional actors, including the latest attack by Israel against Iranian military facilities, and strongly condemns any action that escalates already volatile situation. All parties should exercise maximum restraint. In Lebanon, fighting between the IDA and Hezbollah continues, affecting civilians on both sides of the Blue Line. More than 2,000 people have been killed since last year. Over 1 million people have been forced to flee their homes. Many have crossed into Syria. The crisis is spreading. To prevent further escalation, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah and urge all parties to make sincere efforts for diplomatic settlement. Significantly increasing the flow of humanitarian assistance is vital in addressing the needs of the people in Lebanon who are suffering at this very moment. Japan has recently decided to extend an emergency grant of $10 million for humanitarian assistance to the people in Lebanon. Today, we also decided to provide an additional $10 million in response to the humanitarian situation in Syria, which has witnessed the influx of the displaced people from Lebanon. Mr. President, finally, Japan reiterates that only a two-state solution can finally resolve this conflict. Peace cannot be achieved through belligerency, but only through diplomacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
President. And I'd like to thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing today. President, the death of Hamas leader who had the blood of innocent Israelis and Palestinians on his hand must be a turning point in this dreadful conflict, which has now claimed over 43,000 lives in Gaza. This is the time to urgently cease seize a ceasefire in Gaza and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages who have suffered in inhumane conditions for over a year. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is horrific. Acute malnutrition is now a reality for many. This month, the least aid has entered Gaza since the beginning of the conflict, and the situation in northern Gaza is especially alarming. Gazans have been asked to evacuate the north in their hundreds of thousands, but there is nowhere safe to go. In recent weeks, just as we have seen throughout the conflict, Israeli strikes have hit designated humanitarian zones. On Thursday, we saw again profoundly distressing scenes after an Israeli strike on Al-Shuhada, a school-turned-shelter in Nuseirat refugee camp, which killed at least 17 people, including 9 children. We remain very concerned, too, about the severe impacts of these strikes on civilian infrastructure, including healthcare facilities, which face critical shortages in medical supplies, food and water. Israel must comply fully with international humanitarian law. As my Prime Minister has said, the world will not tolerate any more excuses from Israel on humanitarian assistance. There is no justification for denying civilians access to essential supplies. The government of Israel must do more to protect civilians, civilian infrastructure, and allow aid to be delivered safely and at scale. Related to this, reports that UN agencies have had to postpone the rollout of the polio vaccine campaign in northern Gaza are deeply disturbing. Israeli authorities must allow aid workers to carry out this work safely and securely. We also unequivocally reject attempts to undermine or degrade UNRWA, which is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and a lifeline for hundreds of thousands of civilians there and in the wider region. The allegations against UNRWA staff earlier this year were fully investigated. There is no justification for cutting off ties with UNRWA. Israel must abide by its obligations and ensure UNRWA can continue its life-saving work. President, we reiterate that northern Gaza must not be cut off from the south. Palestinian civilians, including those evacuated from northern Gaza, must be permitted to return. There must be no forcible transfer of Gazans from or within Gaza, nor any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. Civilians must be protected. In the West Bank, the level of illegal settlement expansion and settler violence is unprecedented. Israel must take action now to address this. President, a sustainable solution to this crisis cannot and will not be achieved through unilateral action. The international community and this Council have been clear and unified in our commitment to the two-state solution, which is the only viable path to a long-term peaceful solution. The Palestinian and Israeli people alike have a right to self-determination, safety and security, and we must all work together to provide a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome your presiding the Council today, demonstrating importance that Switzerland attaches to the responsibility of the Council towards the current tragic crisis in the Middle East. I also want to thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his commitment and for his briefing today. Colleagues, Slovenia is horrified by the level of death, injury, destruction and suffering in North Gaza. We are shocked watching the most devastating bombardment of civilian population and civilian infrastructure since the Second World War. We are shocked by reports of severely maimed children left to die in Gaza because their transfer for treatment abroad was denied by Israel. We are shocked by information on health workers being detained and others being prevented from saving people's lives. Shocked by the fact that everything is lacking: food, life-saving health care, shelter. But first and foremost, we are shocked by the lack of humanity. We remind that collective punishment and starvation is prohibited as a method of warfare. We reject forced displacement. As violations continue, we repeat our call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. We repeat our call on Israel to allow unimpeded access to United Nations and humanitarian organizations. We call for aid to be delivered at scale. Famine is at the doors of Gaza. Once famine is declared, it is already too late. We furthermore call for establishment of adequate conditions for finalization of polio vaccination campaign, which has been postponed. Instead of steps taken to alleviate human suffering, it seems steps are taken to augment it. We denounce the passing of legislation of UNRWA in Knesset. If implemented, it would have severe impact on the work of UNRWA in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and potentially in the region. UNRWA is the backbone of humanitarian response in Gaza and a lifeline for Palestinian refugees. This has been reaffirmed in shared commitments on UNRWA, which has garnered support of 123 signatories, including all members of the Security Council. Full implications of the laws are yet to be analyzed. However, their implementation would, in our view, constitute a direct breach of Israel's obligations under international law and UN Charter. We are alarmed by the situation in the West Bank, including settlement policies, demolitions, and restrictions. The ICJ has been clear. The occupation is unlawful and it must end. We condemn settler violence, including in the context of the ongoing olive harvesting season. We once again underline our call for an immediate ceasefire. As suffering is deepening, it is more essential than ever to take immediate steps towards ceasefire and release of hostages. We welcome efforts of our partners to achieve a diplomatic solution. This includes short-term arrangements which could contribute to alleviating suffering of people in Gaza. This must be complemented by serious and irreversible steps to achieving a long-term solution, which can only be in the form of the two-state solution. Mr. President, just as Palestinian and Israeli people in Lebanon deserve peace. We urge Israel to hold its military operation. Escalation of conflicts cannot bring peace and security to peoples and states in the region. We are appalled by the deepening humanitarian crisis in Lebanon, including through impact of airstrikes and the mass displacement. We condemn the attacks on UNIFIL and underline the need to ensure and respect safety and security of UN peacekeepers. We welcome the holding of international conference in support of Lebanon's people and sovereignty in Paris. Swift and full implementation of Resolution 1701 is essential. Colleagues, As the situation is becoming more extreme, our opposition to violations of international law must become stronger. Silence is assent. Therefore, we cannot allow ourselves to accept a numbing effect of the scale of violation. We also cannot allow ourselves to be disillusioned by lack of action in this Council. This Council could do and should do more. The war must end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I begin by thanking you for chairing this quarterly open debate on the situation in the Middle East. I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his sobering briefing. Malta remains gravely concerned about the war in Gaza, the worsening situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as the spreading of the conflict into Lebanon and the wider regional implications of these prolonged conflicts. While our commitment to secure a stable, peaceful Middle East remains unshaken, the unabating attacks and violence, coupled by this Council's inability to act or implement its resolutions, are deeply worrying. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire must be established. The images and scenes coming out of Gaza depict a horrific situation. Across the entire Strip, unprecedented threats to civilians are rampant. The humanitarian situation has long become catastrophic. Weeks of relentless Israeli shelling and hostilities in the north, including on schools, hospitals, places of worship, and displacement camps, have caused mass casualty incidents. Countless civilians, especially women and children, continue to suffer forced and repeated displacement. The cut-off of humanitarian aid is further compounding this situation. The UN and its implementing partners continue to face severe and unlawful obstructions by Israeli authorities in delivering critical aid to North Gaza. Most aid convoys are denied access on a daily basis. WFP has warned that the threat of famine is growing. Immediate and sustained humanitarian access across the Gaza Strip is desperately needed. We unequivocally condemn all actions that target civilians and civilian infrastructure. All parties must adhere to international law, including through the implementation of the ICJ's orders on provisional measures. We reiterate our condemnation of Hamas for its reprehensible terrorist attacks of 7th October 2023, and that Israel has the right to protect itself in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law. We similarly demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other armed groups, and condemn the continued indiscriminate rocket fire endangering civilian population centers in Israel. President, in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Israel's unilateral actions, including illegal settlement expansions, dispossession, arbitrary detainment, and continued raids in the West Bank, make life intolerable for Palestinians. Extremist settler violence fosters further instability. Furthermore, the status quo must be maintained and threats to the holy sites must cease. We recall the ICJ's advisory opinion of 19th July, which stated that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must end as soon as possible. Malta is deeply concerned with the steps taken by the Israeli Knesset yesterday to abrogate UNRWA's ability to function in the OPT. These actions are contrary to international law, further entrench the occupation, have immediate devastating implications for millions of Palestinians, and broad regional consequences. UNRWA is a stabilizing force in the region and an irreplaceable actor for Palestinian refugees. We call on Israel to rescind this legislation and ensure UNRWA's unhindered access to those in need. Equally crucial is international support for the Palestinian Authority as it pursues revitalization. President, Malta is also gravely concerned over the escalating military situation in Lebanon. We condemn the alarming toll on civilians and widespread displacement taking place. We call for an urgent cessation of hostilities across the Blue Line and demand a ceasefire rooted in Resolution 1701. Hezbollah's rocket attacks must end, and Lebanon's sovereignty and territorial integrity must be upheld. Bolstering Lebanon's state institutions, particularly the Lebanese armed forces, is also critical. As a troop-contributing country, Malta is deeply concerned by recent assaults on UNIFIL peacekeepers. Such acts are blatant violations of international law and undermine the mission's critical role. The Security Council must stand united in its unwavering support for peacekeepers. Furthermore, we also need to maintain focus on the recent attacks and retaliatory strikes between Israel and Iran, which risks further widening the conflict. We urge all parties to de-escalate in order to break the cycle of escalation and avoid an all-out regional war. President, our immediate priority at this pivotal moment must be de-escalation and accountability. Diplomacy and concerted efforts towards ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon are essential to prevent further bloodshed. Beyond the immediate crisis, our long-term objective must be the credible and irreversible realization of the two-state solution in accordance with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This is the only path that will ensure lasting peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis and the entire region. This Council has not only the tools but also the responsibility to act decisively, and Malta stands ready to act. Let us not delay any further. The future of the region depends on the actions we take today. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. I welcome all ministers and their participation in this quarterly open debate. On 24th October, just 5 days ago, the United Nations commemorated 79 years of its establishment with the primary purpose of upholding international peace and security and avoiding another major war, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The situation in the Middle East is, however, deeply troubling. The ongoing illegal occupation of the State of Palestine by the State of Israel, compounded by the escalation following the 7th October attacks, has exacerbated the conflict. The acts of aggression by Israel in Lebanon and the incessant Hezbollah rocket attacks on Israel, the attacks on UN peacekeepers, retaliatory strikes involving Iran and Israel, and assault by and retaliatory strikes against the Houthis in Yemen further complicates this already volatile landscape. These events challenge the very raison d'etre of the United Nations, our understanding of the safeguards provided by international law, and the values we profess to uphold. UNRWA, a United Nations entity, is being targeted by inter alia by a hostile legislation. We agree with the views expressed by the United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, that the law adopted by the Knesset of Israel banning UNRWA in Israel, and I quote, could have devastating consequences for Palestinian refugees, end of quote. As we approach this debate, over a year since the recent escalation, it is essential to acknowledge the grim realities as presented by our briefer. And so I take this opportunity to thank Mr. Tor Wennesland, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for his sobering and comprehensive briefing. Mr. President, over 70 years since the question of Palestine was first brought before the United Nations, we still bear the burden of delivering peace in the region by supporting a two-state solution that guarantees the independence of the Palestinian people and a safe and secure Israel and Palestine. After months of meetings and consultations, the UN Security Council must fulfill its obligation as the primary body responsible for maintaining international peace and security and ensure implementation of its resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. It must implement its resolutions to end the horrifying cycle of death and destruction for the people in Gaza and Greater Palestine, as well as start the important task of reconstruction and rebuilding of the state of Palestine. To achieve these very fundamental objectives, we must be bold in our engagements with the parties to the conflict and be unrelenting in demanding they uphold the principles espoused in the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including international humanitarian law, as well as the binding orders of the International Court of Justice, particularly the provisional measures ordered in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel. For more than 12 months, we've repeated our unequivocal condemnation of the killings of civilians in Gaza, the occupied Palestinian territory, and in Israel. We must emphasize the staggering toll. Over 1,300 Israeli civilians killed, hostages taken, and over 43,000 civilians in Gaza killed, with over 100,000 more injured. This cannot be normalized. We have witnessed regrettably collective punishment, intentional targeting of civilians, denial of humanitarian aid, and the tragic killing of humanitarian workers and journalists. The use of civilians as human shield is a further violation that cannot go unaddressed. Such actions violate the core tenets of international humanitarian law. We have denounced the multiple displacement of civilians and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, including attacks on hospitals and medical facilities, the latest being the attack at Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza over the weekend. We also condemn the recent Beit Lahiwal killings, with a report rising death toll of over 93 Palestinians killed from the previous reported of 60. Every day, statistics provided by OCHA, UNRWA, and other humanitarian organizations point to serious violations of international humanitarian law and resolutions adopted by the Security Council and the General Assembly. While we note the complexity and deep-rooted nature of this conflict, we are of the view that achieving lasting peace and stability in the region will require adherence by the parties to the conflict to international law, including international humanitarian law, and other political and moral imperatives. With our ever-worsening humanitarian crisis, intensified military operations, and tens of thousands of civilian fatalities, Sierra Leone again calls for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and the entire region, and the release of the remaining hostages held by Hamas. A ceasefire is the most practical way to move the process of engagement forward, especially the resuscitated engagement by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, supported by Resolution 2735, and establish the conditions conducive for the foundation of lasting peace. A ceasefire will allow for unhindered supply of essential medical assistance and other humanitarian support, facilitate negotiations and diplomatic efforts to address the underlying issues and pave the way for post-conflict reconstruction. Without a ceasefire, this cruel cycle of indiscriminate attacks on civilians, repeated evacuation orders, displacement, and humanitarian restrictions will continue. An immediate ceasefire would rescue the 1.8 million people across the Gaza Strip experiencing high levels of acute food insecurity, classified as IPC Phase 3, including the 133,000 people facing catastrophic food insecurity and an estimated 60,000 cases of acute malnutrition among children as young as 6-month-old from starvation and death, as outlined in the recent IPC Global Initiative Special Snapshot. It will also protect the humanitarian personnel serving under difficult circumstances, with their safety and well-being under continuous threat. Mr. President, as has already been emphasized by the briefer and other council members, swift and bold political will and good faith efforts are required by all parties to the conflict in Gaza and other parts of the region to bring an end to the fighting and ongoing destruction. This is my delegation's ultimate request in today's quarterly debate, and we stand ready to support all efforts initiated by this Council to secure the freedom of the Israeli hostages and to actualize the long-awaited desire of the civilian population in Gaza, on the occupied Palestinian territory, as well as in Israel, for genuine peace, genuine independence, and peaceful coexistence. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement. I'd now like to give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank you for presiding over this meeting. I would also like to thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for the briefing. Today, the Council is again considering the situation in the Middle East. What is unfolding before our eyes is that Gaza and the Middle East as a whole is experiencing worsening situation, elusive peace prospects, and a looming all-out war. The Council should act immediately on the pressing issues with a view to promoting ceasefire, saving lives, and restoring peace. I wish to stress the following points. First, an immediate and permanent ceasefire is the prerequisite for saving lives and preventing further deterioration of the situation. There is no justification for any delay in ceasefire. The United States has announced that it will reinvigorate ceasefire negotiations. We hope that the negotiations will not fall into the weird cycle of walking on the spot, as we saw in the past several months, nor will they become a pretext for prolonging and expanding the fighting. The relevant diplomatic efforts should not be used as an excuse to obstruct the Council's action. We support the Council in using all the options in its toolbox and take further actions towards a ceasefire. Second, Gaza has been bombarded into a living hell, and northern Gaza is turning into the hell of the hell. Supplies have been cut off. Relief operations denied. Civilians in Jabalia camp evacuated at gunpoint. And patients and doctors at Kamal Adwan Hospital subjected to inhumane treatment. The bottom line of the international humanitarian law has been trampled upon time and again. This is a blot on the conscience of humanity and should not be tolerated at all. Israel must comply with its obligations under the international humanitarian law. No double standards should be allowed in this regard. Third, UNRWA has been providing relief in accordance with the General Assembly mandate. It is the backbone of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. The Israeli Knesset, in total disregard of the strong opposition of the international community, passed 2 bills in an attempt to restrict and close UNRWA. China expresses strong condemnation. Closing the agency would be a new round of collective punishment of millions of Palestinian refugees in the region and would severely affect the humanitarian situation, security, and stability in the region. We call on Israel to halt and revoke the said bills to ensure dignity, safety, and facilitation for the work of UN humanitarian agencies, including UNRWA. Fourth, in the current context, certain countries are continuing their massive supply of weapons to Israel. Whether such acts would contribute to achieving the objectives contained in the Council resolutions, this matter must be taken seriously. The GA Emergency Special Session has adopted a resolution urging all states to stop supplying weapons and equipment that might be used in the occupied Palestinian territory. China recently joined the joint letter initiated by Turkey and over 40 other countries calling for the implementation of this demand from the said resolution of GAESS. We hope that the countries concerned will take seriously the grave consequences of massive weapon supply and stop fueling the flames of military adventurism. Fifth, while the flames of war are raging in Gaza over the past year, the situation in the West Bank has also been deteriorating. Illegal settlements have been expanding, with more than 1,700 Palestinian houses confiscated by force or demolished and thousands of Palestinians displaced. The occupying power has also frequently conducted violence against the Palestinian people and used various means to suppress and restrict the governance of the Palestinian Authority. Such practices are creating a new reality and undermining the conditions on which the two-state solution is based. Preventing the further erosion of the basis of the two-state solution by unilateral actions should be a priority for the international community in advancing Palestinian-Israeli peace in the next phase. Sixth, an all-out war in the region is looming. The recent Israeli invasion into Lebanon, its continuous indiscriminate bombardment, and multiple airstrikes against Iran and Syria. All these acts have violated the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the relevant countries and further destabilized the region. The situation is hanging by a thread. Any irresponsible adventure would be extremely dangerous and would highly likely lead to catastrophic consequences. We urge Israel to reject its obsession with force to prevent the region from being plunged into a larger catastrophe. We also call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, jointly comply with the UN Charter and the principles of international law, and return to the right track of seeking political and diplomatic solutions to disputes. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Switzerland presidency for convening this open debate on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestine question. We also extend our appreciation to Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, for his insights on the current situation on the ground. Mr. President, as just described by the Special Coordinator, the humanitarian situation in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories has reached catastrophic proportion and continues deteriorating. The relentless escalation of violence, particularly targeting innocent populations and civilian infrastructure, stands in stark violation of international humanitarian law and demands our immediate attention. This unprecedented crisis necessitates a unified and decisive action from the Security Council to address both the immediate emergency in Gaza and its broader regional implications. In this connection, it is urgent and imperative that the Security Council expeditiously explore viable alternatives to address this crisis, including strengthening existing resolution through more robust and enforceable measures to guarantee immediate and unhindered humanitarian access to Gaza. Lives are at stake. The resolution of this crisis fundamentally requires the committed engagement and decisive intervention of key Security Council members, recognizing that the stability in the Middle East is vital for regional as well as global security and development. Mr. President, we must acknowledge that the 4 previously adopted resolutions pertaining to Gaza have yet to achieve full implementation. This Council maintains the capacity to formulate more effective approaches to secure an immediate and permanent ceasefire, address the humanitarian crisis, and facilitate the release of all hostages. This endeavor demands renewed commitment and innovative strategies from the international community and this Council. Furthermore, we note with grave concern the recent legislative action by the Israel Knesset banning the United Nations Relief and Works Agency from operating within Israel and occupied territories. This decision, which has drawn widespread international criticism, severely impedes the delivery of essential humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees. It is paramount that all humanitarian actors, including the United Nations agencies and NGOs, be afforded the necessary access and security to fulfill their mandates in accordance with international humanitarian law and human rights principles. The Security Council must transcend mere expression of concern and implement decisive action. Violation of international law and total disregard for civilian rights require a robust and united response from this body. Action is essential to safeguard human life and uphold justice. The gravity of the situation demands immediate attention. Any indication of potential genocide must elicit a comprehensive response utilizing all available diplomatic and legal mechanisms at our disposal. The preservation of human life and dignity must remain our foremost priority. These concerted efforts are critical not only for providing relief to affected populations, but also for maintaining the credibility and moral authority of the international community in crisis response. Mr. President, the Palestine question persists as a fundamental issue affecting diplomatic relations and the strategic interests in the Middle East. Its resolution is key to lasting regional stability and peace. In this regard, we reaffirm our consistent and unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, envisioning Israel and Palestine coexisting peacefully within recognized borders in full accordance with international law and relevant United Nations resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm grateful to Special Coordinator Wennesland for the report he's given us this morning. I also acknowledge the presence of ministers of state who are with us today in this room, including the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Brazil, a country which has presided over this council when the new spiral of violence in the region began. For the members of the council, this council, which has spoken out frequently on this issue, these quarterly open debates are an excellent opportunity for listening to the views of other members of the United Nations, and for that reason I will attempt to be quite brief. More than a year has gone by since the terrorist attacks carried out by Hamas took place on the 7th of October 2023. Ecuador continues to condemn these attacks unequivocally. more than a year of unprecedented violence, which has caused death and suffering both for the Israeli people as well as the Palestinian people, in particular the residents in Gaza. Ecuador reiterates the need for an immediate ceasefire. We also reiterate the need for the immediate release of all hostages and the immediate implementation of the 4 resolutions already adopted by this Council. At the same time, my country recalls that all parties must comply with their obligations pursuant to international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Not to do so will lead to serious consequences. Ecuador deplores all attacks against civilians and critical infrastructure, as well as civilian goods. We also condemn all violence and hostilities against civilians. We must halt the spiral of violence spreading through the region, and we must protect and support the efforts of those who are working to mitigate the suffering and assist war victims pursuant to this Council's Resolution 2730. Mr. President, Ecuador reiterates its support for the work of the United Nations, of its Secretary General, and of all of its agencies. Member states of the United Nations must cooperate with these efforts. This is our organization. We must facilitate its work to the extent possible, and at the very least, we should not hamper its work. The role of UNRWA is particularly important for regional stability. Any decision or action impacting its work is of concern. My country has reiterated these views on a number of occasions. We have always done so with a desire to contribute in good faith to resolving this conflict and to acting constructively, attempting to build bridges and not to exacerbate differences between the parties. Mr. President, thousands of dead and suffering for entire generations. This is proof that the Palestinian question will not be resolved through weapons and violence. Ultimately, the decision must be peaceful, negotiated, and just for the parties, with the existence of 2 states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and relevant resolutions. We must move forward on this path. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement. I will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mauro Luis Yecker Vieira, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Brazil.
Mr. President, the post-war international order is crumbling under our watch. The foundations laid after 2 global conflicts are being eroded. The unfolding events in the Middle East are not just another chapter in an old conflict. They are a stark reflection of a deeper crisis where might makes right and the principles meant to safeguard peace are overshadowed. This is why President Lula has called for a vigorous response to the grave challenges of our time. As he underscored in the opening of the 79th session of the General Assembly, the world needs a comprehensive overhaul of the UN Charter. A Charter Review Conference may seem ambitious, but it reflects the founding vision of the UN. Article 109 makes it clear that no system should remain static in an ever-changing world. Mr. President, the Council's duty is to protect all humanity, not just cater for the few. Its failure to act decisively has allowed the atrocities to continue unchecked, with entire populations paying the price. This is not mere rhetoric. It's reflected in the crimes committed against civilians in Gaza and Lebanon. Over 43,000 Palestinians and 2,500 Lebanese lives have already been lost to the cracks in a global order increasingly failing to uphold its promises. Brazil has been vocal in calling for an end to the escalating violence in the Middle East. Since our presidency of this Council in October last year, when Israel was struck by a terrorist attack, we have witnessed a relentless descent into violence. Israel's responses to October 7 has gone far beyond any sense of proportion. More bombs have fallen on Gaza than on Dresden, Hamburg, and London during the World War II. This is not self-defense, it's collective punishment and obliteration. We have all witnessed blatant and routine violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Civilian areas are indiscriminately and disproportionately targeted in military operations, leading to the destruction of critical infrastructure and suffering of innocent people. Famine and disease are spreading as the supply of basic necessities is severed. Even those protected under the Geneva Conventions, humanitarian workers, doctors and health personnel are being killed. Journalists have been shot and their news outlets silenced. Mr. President, the International Court of Justice has issued provisional measures directing Israel to halt actions that may violate the convention, the Genocide Convention, and facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. Additionally, Resolution 2735 of 2024 demand a full ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli forces from densely populated areas in Gaza, and the safe return of Palestinian civilians to their homes. These are not recommendations. They are binding obligations under international law. When mandatory directives from the highest legal and political bodies are ignored with impunity, it signs a dangerous unraveling of the global governance. The consequence is the disregard is more loss of life and unimaginable destruction. When I last addressed this council a month ago, I warned that Lebanon stood on the edge of a conflict. Today, we mourn the loss of thousands of innocent lives, including 2 Brazilian teenagers. In just 30 days, the number of displaced people in Lebanon was multiplied by tenfold. Since I last sat in this chair, I have been engaged in the urgent task of repatriating thousands of our dual nationals from Lebanon, completing 9 rescue flights by the Brazilian Air Force planes amid increasing security risks, including Israeli airstrikes deep into Lebanese territory. Thousands more await repatriation. Mr. President, the expansion of the war from Gaza to Lebanon shows a familiar pattern of disregard for the law. Assaults against UNRWA and now UNIFIL are a brazen repudiation of the multilateral system and everything the UN Charter represents. This is not the first time UNIFIL has come under fire. We must not forget the 1996 shelling by Israel of the UNIFIL compound in Guyana, where 106 civilians who sought refuge were killed. This tragedy serves as a critical lesson of what happens when the international community allows such violations to go unpunished. When we fail to hold perpetrators accountable, we pave the way for history to repeat itself. This is why Brazil condemns in the strongest terms the deliberate recent attack against the peacekeeping mission's personnel and infrastructure in Lebanon. Brazil also condemns the decision in the Knesset yesterday to pass laws against UNRWA. By attempting to dismantle vital services for Palestinians, these laws deepen the suffering of an already devastated people and run counter the request of International Court of Justice that Israel facilitates access to humanitarian assistance to Gazans. Efforts to undermine UNRWA are not just attacks on an institution, but on the very survival and dignity of the Palestinian people. Targeting UNRWA will neither remove the refugee status of the Palestinian people, nor the responsibility of the international community to protect those in need. We must reject this law for what it is, a dangerous precedent that undermines multilateralism and paves the way for further erosion of the global order. Mr. President, when international law is violated, those responsible must face consequences. It is our duty as UN member states to ensure that justice is enforced, investigations are carried out, responsibility is attributed, and penalties are imposed to prevent impunity and uphold the rule of law. We must uphold justice, not just call for it. In the face of a plausible case of genocide and the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, the international community can no longer be complicit by providing weapons that enable such crimes. The same holds true for weapons that prolong the illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. We cannot allow the veto to become a shield for impunity. Mr. President, every time this Council meets to discuss the Middle East, the situation grows more dire. New front lines emerge, more innocent lives are lost, and the crisis deepens. The recent attack on Iran only served to underscore the escalating risk of a regional catastrophe. We are sliding toward a world where future generations inherit nothing but a legacy of endless conflict and suffering. How many more innocent lives will be counted the next time we convene? How much more suffering will we allow? War will not bring peace to the Middle East. Peace will come through a decisive commitment to diplomacy rooted in justice and respect for international law. As we grapple with escalating violence and the expansion of conflict, President Lula's call for a review of UN Charter resonates more urgently than ever. We owe it to the future generations to ensure that this body has the strength and mandate to uphold justice, protect humanity, and secure lasting peace. It is time to take the bold steps needed to make peace not just an aspiration, but a reality for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Vieira for his statement, and I will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Mr. President, distinguished Minister, we endorse the statements by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, of Mauritania on behalf of the Arab group, of Cameroon on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Conference, and of Senegal as chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. It is inconceivable that after more than a year, the Security Council has not put an end to the genocide being committed against the Palestinian people. More than 43,000 Palestinians have been killed. 70% of them are women and children. More than 2,500 Lebanese have been killed. These figures are growing by leaps and bounds. Far from an immediate and permanent ceasefire, Israel continues to attack hospitals, schools, and refugee camps in the occupied Palestinian territories in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Rather than a ceasefire, Israel is spreading the conflict throughout the Middle East region, expanding its aggression to Lebanon, indiscriminately shelling territories in Syria and Yemen, and starting a new and dangerous escalation against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The government of Israel attacks and spurns the United Nations and its Secretary General, It attacks the security provided by the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon and has kept up the most deadly attacks in Gaza that have been known in history against this organization's staff and humanitarian workers. The occupying power continues to obstruct humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people. The recent approval by the Israeli parliament of a law banning any activity in the OPT by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, known as UNRWA in English, in addition to violating the UN Charter and Israel's obligations under international law, will further the suffering of the Palestinian people. How many children and women must be killed before the international community acts and puts an end to aggression, puts an end to illegal occupation, and provides international protection, which the Palestinian people so urgently need? How much more destruction must take place before rhetorical words and statements are replaced with practical actions against the genocide currently taking place? The impunity with which the current Israeli government continues to act is not only proof of the ineffectiveness of the Security Council, but this is an attack against multilateralism, and it undermines the very essence of the UN Charter and international law. It also means that the Palestinian people are facing a truly existential threat. It means that more innocent people will continue to be killed, maimed, detained, and displaced. Such impunity is only possible with the complicit political, military, logistical, and financial support provided to the occupying power by the United States government, which applies double standards and obstructs Council action. Mr. President, it is not possible to achieve peace in the Middle East without a just solution to the Palestinian question. This is something that the government of Israel is attempting to block by every possible means, destroying the state of Palestine and making a two-state solution impossible. It is not possible to have a sovereign Palestinian state, an independent state, without Gaza and without pre-1967 borders, nor would such a state be possible without East Jerusalem as capital and without the return of refugees. The International Court of Justice, at the request of the UN General Assembly, expressed a clear position. Occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory and the denial of the right of these people to self-determination are illegal actions, and they violate international law. The immediate and unconditional admission of Palestine as a member state of the United Nations is an essential step towards a definitive solution to this conflict. Why does Palestine have to continue to wait before becoming a full-fledged member of the United Nations when Israel did so 75 years ago, pursuant to a resolution in which the two-state solution prevailed? To achieve peace and stability in the region, we also require the complete and unconditional withdrawal of Israel from Syrian Golan and from all occupied Arab territories. We call for a cessation of hostilities and aggression against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the sister nations in the Middle East. Foreign interference in this region must end. We reiterate our appeal for an immediate and unconditional end to the arbitrary and illegal unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States against sovereign countries in the Middle East. Cuba will continue to contribute to all legitimate international efforts to provide a just, broad, and lasting solution to the conflict in the Middle East. We call for united action by all peoples and governments of the world to halt the aggressions by the Israeli government. Every moment of passivity will cost new innocent lives, greater suffering and destruction. Cuba will never be indifferent in the face of injustice. The Palestinian cause and the cause of sister nations of the region can always count on our strong solidarity and support. Thank you.
Merci.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rodriguez Parilla for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
السيد الرئيس.
Mr. President, we thank Switzerland for organizing this open debate on the situation in the Middle East. And we welcome the participation of His Excellency, the Foreign Minister of Switzerland, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, and we thank Mr. Tor Wensland for his briefing. Mr. President, over a year has passed since the events of October 7. The fighting continues. This circle of killing, destruction, and displacement has been expanded. Your august council has not been able to impose a ceasefire in Gaza. The act of aggression has expanded and is now including Lebanon. They are bombing Lebanon with the worst, most lethal and destructive types of weapons. Our children, our women, our paramedics are being targeted with bunker buster bombs, vacuum bombs, and explosive drones. The number of those killed is in the thousands. The international community remains silent, perhaps desensitized by the thousands killed in Gaza. It is no longer moved by the bloodshed or the images of body parts. The credibility of the United Nations and your Council is on the line. All your resolutions on the Middle East are still not implemented. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation is difficult. It is catastrophic. Over 1.4 million Lebanese people over the past few weeks have become internally displaced, fleeing bombing, killing, and destruction. The Israeli killing machine spared no one. Overnight, families have lost their normal life, their homes, their memories, their hopes. They have fled to shelters, seeking security and safety. Israel was able to rob them of their homes, their memories, and their hopes, but they cannot take away their will for life and resistance. This killing machine that has killed children, women, and the elderly recently targeted journalists, paramedics, and medical personnel. They're targeting hospitals. They're targeting cultural and historic sites such as Baalbek and Tyre. With blind hatred, they're bombing history and international civilization and heritage. These acts can only be described as crimes against humanity and war crimes. In a desperate attempt from Israel to kill the solution, it targeted deliberately locations of UNIFIL and the Lebanese army. Israel is trying to destroy Resolution 1701, to invade the land and to evacuate locations of UNIFIL and the army to facilitate this invasion. Mr. President, we would like to thank France and the French President for organizing Paris Conference to support Lebanon and Lebanon's sovereignty on the 24th of October. We also thank all the countries that participated and all the countries and international organizations that contributed. The needs are immense, and the challenges are many, and the reality is bitter. Lebanon has endured a great burden of displacement and cannot confront internal displacement by itself. We are relying on the assistance of everyone. We thank all the countries that helped us to confront this humanitarian tragedy. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Mr. President, all these atrocities could have been avoided. All these massacres could have been stopped. These sacrifices are enough to go back to reason, to reality. The solution is clear and direct. It was produced by this Council. The solution is in Resolution 1701. To put an end to the acts of aggression, to guarantee the deployment of the Lebanese army, to withdraw weapons to achieve stability. It is not a magical recipe. There is no supernatural solution. We will not be reinventing the wheel. This solution would spare bloodshed, destruction, and senseless acts, because the acts of Israel can only be described as senseless. The government and people of Lebanon do not want war. We want the implementation of Resolution 1701 in its entirety. The international community wants the implementation of Resolution 1701. The Security Council wants the implementation of Resolution 1701. The mediators are present around this table. They have been providing solutions for the past 13 months. However, on the other side, we have one party that do not wish for a solution, that wants to sacrifice additional lives, wants to go on with the war for only one reason, for personal agendas and ambitions. If they wanted to give precedence to the interest of their people, they would have ended the war immediately, would have spared bloodshed, and would have implemented the solution. Mr. President, Lebanon emphasizes the need to implement Security Council Resolution 1701 in its entirety. The Lebanese foreign minister provided steps for the implementation process. 1. The withdrawal of Israel of all Lebanese territory occupied during its last aggression, and to go back to its side of the border, according to the Truth Agreement of 1949. 2. Enhancing the deployment of the Lebanese army south of the Litani River and along the southern border, so that there is no weapon outside the approval of the government of Lebanon, and there is no authority outside the authority of the government of Lebanon, according to Resolution 1701. 3. Make sure IDPs return to their homes and their villages. 4. To resume indirect negotiations that are currently on hold under the auspices of the United Nations and the participation of one or more international mediators to resolve pending points according to Resolution 1701. 5. To start a serious negotiation process with a specific timeline to return the Sheba Farms and Kfar Shuba Hills to Lebanon, and Point B1 in Ras Al Nakura. To rebuild what was destroyed, to reform agricultural land that was polluted with white phosphorus, to remove any remnants of the aggression against Lebanon, so that we can provide a decent life to the citizens of the south of Lebanon, and finally provide financial and technical assistance to enhance the capacity of the Lebanese state, whether in its civil or military institutions. Mr. President, the United Nations and its agencies during the past 80 years have put in place principles and conventions to regulate and organize international relations. However, Israel, during the past 13 months, destroyed all these frameworks and conventions and laws that were put in place like a spoiled child. Because you've spoiled it so much, it has destroyed everything. How can you, after all that has happened, how can you call for the implementation of these laws and conventions? Double standards is very clear in this case. Mr. President, even laws have rules, have restrictions. International law, international humanitarian law, has detailed these restrictions, these rules. However, Israel, unfortunately, continues to ignore the principles of international humanitarian law and the law of war. Mr. President, we will give you a copy of the UN Charter so that you can share this copy with Israel. We do hope that you will remind Israel of the content of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions. Maybe then they will respect these conventions. In conclusion, it is our legitimate right to respond to what was said in the previous session, and therefore we say to everyone, our natural position is behind the plate of the Lebanese Republic. We will defend our country and the rights of our people, and we will defend the Lebanese flag and our trees. I thank you.
I'd like to thank the representative of Lebanon for his statement. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, there are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. With the concurrence of members of the Security Council, I propose that we suspend this meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.